Petitions. Presenting petitions, the honourable member for Fredericton. Okay, they will go to the honourable member, presenting petitions, the honourable member for Peace River Westlock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I've got a number of petitions to present. The first one is from people across Canada who have signed a petition. They're calling on the government to focus in on the treatment of Uyghurs in China. Particularly, they're calling for Magnitsky sanctions to be placed on the Chinese officials that are contributing to the Uyghur persecution, and for the Canadian government to recognize the treatment of Uyghurs in China as a genocide. The next petition I have, Mr. Speaker, is from Canadians from across the country. They're calling on the House of Commons to provide conscience protections for physicians and healthcare workers and institutions, Mr. Speaker. The third petition I have to present today is on behalf of Canadians from across the country, and they are seeking to support the health and safety of Canadian firearms owners. They are recognizing the importance of the ownership of firearms and the impacts to hearing loss that come from the noise levels that happen with the use of firearms, and they're calling on the government to ensure that we can bring in useful tools to ensure that Canadians' health and safety is protected while using their firearms. The next petition I have, Mr. Speaker, is from Canadians from across Canada, and they're calling on the government to implement a national strategy on palliative care. These petitioners are calling for Canada to ensure that all Canadians have access to palliative care and are comfortable in the time of their death. The Canadians have signed this petition, are hoping for a national strategy on palliative care. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity.
Presenting petitions, the honourable member for Cariboo Prince George.
Mr. Speaker, when COVID-19 shut down Canada earlier this year, we knew that the air transport industry would be amongst the worst impacted. What we didn't know was that this government was going to do absolutely nothing to provide the Canadians employed in that industry any support. Today, on behalf of the 14,645 Canadians that have signed the petition and the over 633,000 Canadians that depend on our air transport industry for their livelihoods, I'm tabling a petition calling on the government to get back to work, show some leadership, and come up with a plan to save our air transport industry. Mr. Speaker, it's time that this minister and this government get out of the lounge into the cockpit and pilot our industry through this pandemic. Thank you very much.
Presenting petitions, the honourable member for Kootenay, Columbia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The undersigned Canadians have asked that I present this petition, and it is to formally recognize Uyghurs in China have been and are subject to genocide, as well to use the Victims of Corrupt Foreign Officials Act, the Magnitsky Act, and sanction those that are responsible for the heinous crimes being committed against the Uyghur people.
Presenting petitions, the honourable member for South Okanagan, West Kootenay.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I rise here today again to present a petition from young people in my riding of South Okanagan, West Kootenay, and the neighbouring riding of Kootenay, Columbia. They're concerned about climate change, and they point out that Canada's targets are inadequate, and action on those targets has even been weaker. They want jobs that are sustainable and not for short-term gain at the expense of future generations. They therefore ask the government to support their future with a detailed climate strategy with science-based targets, elimination of fossil fuel subsidies, and redirecting those funds to renewable energy systems, energy efficiency, low-carbon transportation, and job training. Thank you.
Presenting petitions, the honourable member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have three petitions to present. The first is an e-petition signed by 1,050 Canadians who are calling on the federal government to establish a committee to update the federal child support guidelines. The petitioners note that the guidelines have not been updated since 1997, are based upon outdated assumptions that pick winners and losers, and do not bear the true costs of rearing a child, particularly for parents with less access and who have had more than one divorce. The second petition, Mr. Speaker, relates to international human organ trafficking. The petitioners call upon the government to amend the criminal code as well as the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act to prohibit Canadians from traveling abroad to acquire human organs removed without consent and to deem inadmissible all permanent residents or foreign nationals involved in this egregious human rights abuse. And the final petition, Mr. Speaker, is signed by 46 Canadians. They wish to bring to this House's attention egregious human rights abuses being perpetrated by the Chinese Communist regime against Uyghur Muslims, including invasive surveillance, arbitrary detention, destruction of cultural sites, forced labor, and even forced human organ harvesting. And they call for this House to recognize that the Uyghurs have been subjected to a genocide, and they call on the government to impose Magnitsky sanctions on those responsible. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Petitions, the Honourable Member for Renfrew, Nipissing, Pembroke.
Mr. Speaker, these petitioners call on the government to draw their attention to the practice of trafficking of human organs. They're ripped out of the bodies of the victims without consent, and they're sold for profit. And Canadians are allowed to go abroad and buy these organs. So there are two bills before Parliament, one here in the House of Commons, one before the Senate, and these petitioners want Parliament to get on with it and get them passed.
Presenting petitions, the Honourable Member for Nanaimo Ladysmith.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honour and privilege to table petition E2776. The petitioners are concerned about the Canada Pension Plan investments of over $200 million in foreign open-net pen salmon farms. Open-net pen salmon farms contaminate wild salmon habitat with chemicals, parasites, viruses, and diseases, all of which threaten the health of wild Pacific salmon runs. To protect their wild salmon populations, Washington State passed legislation banning PRV-infected farmed salmon in 2018. Divesting Canadians' pensions from PRV-infected salmon farms is an important step in protecting wild salmon. And the petitioners are calling on the Government of Canada to request that the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board divest from open-net pen aquaculture investment opportunities, foreign-owned or otherwise. Thank you.
Presenting petitions, présentation de pétition, the Honourable Member for Prince George Rocky. That's what it is, exactly. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It took me a while first to. I have two petitions here today on two very serious subjects, Mr. Speaker. One petition that wants to formally recognize the Uyghurs in China have been and are being subject to genocide. Use the Justice for Victims of Corrupt Foreign Officials Act and sanction those that are responsible for the heinous crimes being committed against the Uyghur people. The second petition is just very similar to my colleague from Ontario. We're raising concerns about the international trafficking in human organs removed from victims without consent, and that they're being harvested and actually being sold. And so there's a group of many Canadians that are concerned about that issue as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Presenting petitions, présentation de pétition, the Honourable Member for, and I always, that's, can I, Hastings, Lennox, and Addington. No, there's one missing in there, isn't there? Anyways, go ahead, please.
Mr. Speaker, I have a similar petition as those just raised by my two colleagues in relation to the concern that we have with international human trafficking in relation to organ harvesting that's done without the victim's consent. A truly grisly practice, and there are two bills right now, Bill C-350 and Bill S-240, that address that. And I have a petition in relation to concerns that petitioners have with that. Thank you so much.
Presenting petitions. Présentation de pétition. Questions on the order paper. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you.
Yukon has a point of order.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, this might be an appropriate time, given one of the earlier petitions presentation, to remind the members that when they present a petition, they should not express their view or give a personal speech related to the petition, just what's in the petition.
Thank you very much. The honourable member for Yukon has a very good point, and I've reminded members before, try to keep it as concise as possible, and just tell us what the bill is. It's not a time for debate. That'll come later on if it ever hits the floor of the chamber. Thank you. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The following questions will be answered today. Question 102 to 104, 108, and 111 and 114.
Is it the pleasure of the House that the aforementioned questions be made orders for return and that they be tabled immediately? Agreed? Agreed and so ordered. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Furthermore, if a revised response to question 79, originally tabled on November 16, 2020, and the government's responses to questions numbers question 98 to 101, 105 to 107, question 109, question 110, question 112, and question 113 could be made for orders for return, these returns would be tabled immediately.
Pleasure of the House that the aforementioned questions be made orders for return and that they be tabled immediately? Agreed? Agreed and so ordered. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
And finally, Mr. Speaker, I would ask that all remaining questions be allowed to stand at this time, please.
Agreed? Agreed and so ordered. Notice of motions for the production of papers. Request for emergency debates. The Honourable Member for Banff Airdrie.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today on an imperative matter for discussion requiring urgent consideration by this House pursuant to Standing Order 52. A new administration has just been elected in the United States, and they indicated during the campaign that they intend to cancel the Keystone XL project. And of course, this Liberal government has made it clear that they will give no more than a half-hearted, supposed attempt at advocacy for such an important project for this country. This is a vital project that will bring billions of dollars to the Canadian economy every year, and it requires urgent and sustained advocacy immediately from this government. That's why Parliament must give this matter emergency consideration. We're all in this together. That's a phrase that we have heard often as of late, Mr. Speaker, but it appears to only be empty rhetoric for this Liberal government when it comes to standing up for Alberta, our natural resource sector, and for the Keystone XL project. Within days of the Liberals being elected in 2015, the American administration rejected the Keystone XL proposal, and the Prime Minister, infamously refused to stand up for this important project, instead saying the Canada-U.S. relationship is bigger than any one project, and I look forward to a fresh start. In other words, just brushing it off, brushing it aside. He refused to initiate a NAFTA challenge for the project. He refused to support any legal challenges in support of the project. In essence, he refused to show any actual, tangible support for the project. But he's been abundantly clear as well on his plan to landlock Canadian oil. Bill C-48, Bill C-69, and his comment that the oil sands needed to be phased out. But every day, I hear from Westerners about how they're struggling to make ends meet, how they're struggling to feed their children or pay their rent because they're out of work. You know, I'll just read from, very quickly, Mr. Speaker, from a text that I received from my brother recently, because I asked him if he'd been able to find a job. And he's one of many people that I could say the same about. And he said to me that he had phoned 18 different companies that just the other day, like he does basically every week, and said to me that not one of them had a job right now, not one of them. And he said, you know, that even last winter, they all would have had at least one project on the go. Some of them had either 2 or 3 projects, but now none of them. And he said that out of all the guys he knows from the industry, and he's worked in the industry for decades now, only 3 of them were working right now. 3 out of dozens and dozens of people that he knows. Talked about it on his own street alone, how there was basically none of his neighbors on the whole street were working right now. 4 of them had homes up for sale. That's very typical of what we see in my province of Alberta right now. That's because this government has shown no attention, care, or concern for the need for this project, for the need to put our industry that supplies so much for this country back to work. And the responsibility clearly then lies directly at the feet of this Liberal government and their misguided policies that have absolutely kneecapped the Alberta economy. But I want to make it clear that it's also bigger than just about Alberta or the West. This is a project for all of Canada, and it's a way forward for economic recovery post-COVID-19. For every direct job created in the oil sands industry, there are 2.5 indirect jobs created in the rest of Canada. So when Alberta succeeds, Canada succeeds. So, Mr. Speaker, I thank you for your consideration on this very important matter, and I sincerely hope that you will grant this request. Thousands of jobs, thousands of families' livelihoods are at stake. Frankly, the very unity of this country could be at stake.
I thank the honourable member for Brant Airdrie for his intervention. However, I'm not satisfied that his request meets the exigencies of standing orders at this time. The honourable member for Peace River Westlock is rising on a point of order, a point of privilege.
Point of privilege.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I rise on a question of privilege to bring to your attention and to the government's response to my question on the order paper. Sorry, Mr. Speaker. Question on the order paper number Q97. This was tabled earlier this week on Monday, November the 16th. I am bringing you this matter at the first available opportunity since I've become aware of it. Q97 asked, and I quote, "With regard to flights on government aircraft for personal and non-governmental business by the Prime Minister and his family and by ministers and their families since January 1st, 2016, A, what were the details of such flights, including the date, the origin, the destination, the names of the passengers, excluding the security detail, and for each flight, what was the total amount reimbursed to the government by each passenger?" The response was signed by the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of National Defence on behalf of the Minister of National Defence. According to the government's response on July 1st, 2016, a government aircraft flew the Prime Minister, his immediate family, along with Ms. Gregoire Trudeau's parents, the caregiver, Marianne Payot, from Vancouver to Tofino. However, the government's own flight logs, which have been released through access to information, indicate that the information contained in the government's response to Q97 is factually incorrect. For example, the flight logs for the trip indicate that Mrs. Anna Granny, then the Liberal Party president, was on that flight on July 31st. In addition, the answer to Q97 indicates that Anna Granny was on the flight from Tofino to Vancouver on August 13, 2016. However, according to the government's own flight logs, Ms. Granny was not on the August 13th flight. There's also a significant discrepancy in the government's response to Q97 and the flight logs about which the Prime Minister's family's caregivers were on a number of flights in July and August of 2016. According to the response signed by the Minister of National Defence, Marianne Payot was on the flights both to and from Tofino. However, according to the flight logs, Mrs. Payot was not on those flights. However, Alexandria Overing, who was identified as a caregiver in a Globe and Mail article from October 31st, 2016, is listed on the flight logs. In fact, that same Globe and Mail article from October 31st, 2016 confirmed that Anna Granny traveled from Vancouver to Tofino. Kate Purchase, who was the Prime Minister's Director of Communication, is also quoted in that article saying that Ms. Graney traveled to Tofino as a guest of the Prime Minister and reimbursed the cost of the equivalent commercial flight. It is clear from both the flight logs and the comments of the former Prime Minister's communication director that Ms. Graney was on the flight from Vancouver to Tofino. However, the answer that I got to Q97 does not list Ms. Graney as a passenger on that flight. The fact that this basic information in the government's response is incorrect and does not match up with the facts contained in the government's own logs is very concerning and hinders my ability as a member of Parliament to hold the government to account. On December 16, 1980, at page 5797 of Hansard, the Speaker ruled, and I quote, "While it is correct to say that the government is not required by our rules to answer written or oral questions, it would be bold to suggest that no circumstance should ever exist for a prima facie question of privilege to be made where there was a deliberate attempt to deny answers to an honourable member." On page 234 of the second edition of Joseph Mago's Parliamentary Privilege in Canada, it states that in order for the Speaker to find a prima facie question of privilege and an admission by someone in authority, such as a Minister of the Crown, or an officer of a department, or an instrument of a government policy, or a government agency, whether that member of the House of Commons was intentionally misled, or an admission of facts that led naturally to the conclusion that a member was intentionally misled. As I mentioned earlier, a Globe and Mail article from October 31st, 2016 quoted Kate Purchase admitting to the facts that leads naturally to the conclusion that I was misled, namely that Anna Gainey traveled from Tofino as a guest of the Prime Minister. It is vital for this House that this information be tabled accurately in the Parliament. False or misleading information should never be tabled in this House, especially not in a response to a formal question on the order paper. I would suggest that in the case of the Minister of National Defence and his Parliamentary Secretary who signed the letter, they have misled this House in an answer containing false information. At very least, various actors involved in this case have cast enough doubt as to warrant an investigation by the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. In Joseph Mago's second edition of Parliamentary Procedure in Canada, at page 227, it states, "In the final analysis, in areas of doubt, the Speaker simply asks, does the Act contain the appearance or appear at first sight to be a breach of privilege? Or to put it shortly, has the member argued the point? If the Speaker feels in any doubt of the question, he should leave it to the House." This citation in reference to the ruling from March 21st, 1978, page 3975 of the debates, where the Speaker cites the report of the UK Select Committee on Parliamentary Privileges, and from a ruling of October 10th, 1989, at page 4457 to 61 of the debates. And finally, in a ruling on October 21st, 1966, at page 9005 of the debates, the Speaker said, "In considering this matter, I ask myself, what is the duty of the Speaker in cases of doubt? If we take into consideration the moment that the Speaker is not asked to render a decision onto whether or not the article complained of a constitutes a breach of privilege, considering also that the Speaker is the guardian of the rules, the rights and the privileges of this House and of its members, and he cannot deprive them of such privileges when there is uncertainty in his mind. I think that this is a preliminary stage of the proceedings. The doubt which I have in my mind should be interpreted to the benefit of the member." Mr. Speaker, I hope you take this matter under consideration, and I would be prepared to move the appropriate motion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I want to thank the honourable member for Peace River Westlock. I'll take that under advisement and return to the House should I see fit. At this time, orders of the day.
Order du jour, ordre émanant du gouvernement.
Government orders, government bills comments. Second reading of Bill C-10, an act to amend the Broadcasting Act.